Hey everybody out there in the nation, got another video for you today. Today we're going to be changing out the front rotors, rear rotors, brake pads, all the new guide pins and hardware to go with it. We're going with the drilled and slotted rotors. Not necessarily anything wrong with what we currently have, but we're just kind of going more with the all black look, trying to black it out. So we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to go ahead and get these center caps removed on the front and the rear, and we're just going to work on one side at a time. So we're going to go ahead and break loose all of our wheel lug nuts here on the front and the back, and then we'll get our jacks, jack it up, place the jack stands, and get the tires off. For safety, we went ahead and jacked it up. Got the jack stand underneath there. Gonna leave the jack for secondary, extra holding power. And then, as you can see down here, I have the wheels chocked, so nothing's rolling forward. We'll go ahead and get started. So I got the wheel off, and the first thing I had noticed that there is a spring that's broke. So part of our hardware kit already has this spring, but you can see it's just hanging out, and then you can see what it was doing to the rotor as it spin around. And you can clearly see that the brake pads aren't that bad, but like I said, we're replacing this because we're gonna do a blackout, and then we'll have another video in the future for the brake calipers will be painted black also. So the first thing we're gonna start off is the cotter pins. There's one here, there's one down here, and then we're going to push the two pins out and then remove the spring tension, and then we can go ahead and remove the brake pads at that point in time, but just to get everything loose before we actually start removing the caliper. One of the things I kind of forgot to mention was I like to put a tub underneath everything down here. One, it helps with the cleanup later on, and then you can see as I pulled all the parts out, it's just a parts collector of junk stuff that we won't be using in the future. So it's pretty much going to be trash, but this just kind of helps keep the workspace clean. Because I'm not reusing the rotors or the pads, I just went ahead with a flathead screwdriver and pried enough to open this area up to get the pad pushed back a little bit, and the other pad pushed back just so this is all free. I'll get these two brake pads out, but you might reconsider that if you're going to be reusing your rotor, not to be prying on the rotor or scoring anything up. So we'll get those pulled out. Have the brake pads removed. Now you can see a lot of space in between the rotor and the caliper. On the back side we have two bolts that we're going to be dealing with. They're 18 millimeter. One's high, and then there's the other one down low, right there on the right hand side. So we'll go ahead and get those broke loose, and then we can remove the caliper. So two bolts are removed. One thing you want to do is use a bungee cord or some kind of hook, hanger, whatever, and go ahead and hook your brake caliper up so it's up out of the way, not tugging on the brake line at all. So now we're going ahead and work on the rotor. The rotor's on there pretty well. I went ahead and added a little PB blaster around the hub into the holes. There's also two holes here that'll be our next thing that we'll shoot for if we just can't pop it off. So I'm going to go ahead and just hit it with a hammer, give it some firm blows, and see what happens. So the PB blaster worked. Just had to let it set a little bit. Gave some firm blows around the hub of the rotor. Broke it loose. So we'll get all this cleaned up with a wire brush. Even a little bit back here by the speed sensor. Get all that cleaned up. And then get ready to install the rotor. I went ahead and just took a simple wire brush, brushed up all the areas that I could around the hub. Want to keep this as flush with the rotor as we can, and even down in here, making sure there's no big giant chunks of any metal or anything. A little bit back there. Sprayed it down with some brake parts cleaner, and we'll go to the next part. I went ahead and added the anti-seize all over the hub, all the way around it, around the edges. And then now we're going to go ahead and work on getting this caliper all cleaned up, so I'll have to wire brush this all off. And then make sure those pistons are fully pushed in. Because after we put the rotor on, got to make sure that the new pads and everything slide together. Alright, we have the caliper all wire brushed up. Went ahead and cleaned the rotor up with the brake parts cleaner, both sides. Installed the lug nut so that this is flush as I'm reinstalling the caliper, and then we'll slide in the brake pads. On the caliper, I went ahead and added some high temp silicone that's specifically for brake, and you can see the shiny added on the rubber and anywhere where the pads are going to glide, the surface where the pads are going to rest. So I'll go ahead and get this caliper installed. We got the caliper torqued down. It's a pretty high torque setting. You'll have to find the specs online. And then now what I'm going to do is go ahead and clean the brake pads off with some brake parts cleaner, and then we're going to slide them into the slot here in the back. We're going to lube the pins up with the silicone grease and then install our spring right after that. I went ahead and added a little bit of the silicone grease on the back of the pads, and then slid them down the slots. So just kind of put them back to the spot where it looks like they went in, and then we'll use the lube up the guide pins and go ahead and slide those in with the spring at the same time. Alright, the guide pins are in. You can see the cotter pin installed, spring installed with the guide pins. There's really only one way that you can put the spring in. Those little notches on the side would be flipped towards the rotor, and also this little tab would be towards the rotor, so it wouldn't go that way. So now I'm just going to go ahead and spray down the rotor again, and we can go ahead and install the wheel. I will also put a little bit of the anti-seize on the back of the wheel. Add a little anti-seize on the back of the wheel, and that way you don't have to worry about the full hub. Just the wheel section that's going to be in contact, and you have to worry about the corrosion. So we'll go ahead and get the wheel on and get it torqued down. Okay, we got the wheel on, lug nuts torqued down, center cap put on, and we'll be moving back to the back wheel. Coming up next. Before we get started on the rear rotors and brakes, I want to go ahead and give you the part numbers for the front. This will be the front driver side. So 633-93000L. L obviously means left. And then for your ceramic brake pads, 1310-1119-00. And then for the hardware kit, 340-76057. One other little tip is that when you're dealing with the slotted rotors, the direction of the slot should be facing towards the rear of the vehicle. So that's just an extra tip. Alright, so we're looking at the rear brakes now. You can see the two pads here and here. There's a bracket that we have new. So the first thing we're going to do is actually remove this bolt, and there's another bolt down here that we'll remove. That allows us to pull the pins out. The caliper will come off. We can get the pads out, lube up the inside of those glide pins, and then start changing out the rotor also. So we'll get to it. So on these two bolts, this is a 14 millimeter. That's a 14 millimeter down here. I just use a little piece of conduit as my breakover bar that I slide over my ratchet, because I officially don't have a 3/8 breakover bar, but it wasn't on there that tight, so we'll get those out. Okay, so again, I was able to take my screwdriver and pry both the pads back. These pads are pretty worn, so it's definitely time that they need to be changed anyway, so good timing on this one. And we'll get this caliper up on a bungee cord hanging from up here, and then we'll go ahead and get those brake pads out. Okay, so we got the pads out. Like I said, they're pretty trashed out. There's a little bracket that hangs, that hooks over the top of this, whatever you want to call it, but just look at the orientation of how this goes on before you install your new one. So there's an upper and a lower when you get ready to assemble it back together. We got two bolts that we are going to work on here on the back side. Yeah, right in there and there, to get the rest of this caliper off. This little bracket that the caliper attaches to. So I was able to get that one down there. Let's get this to zoom. And then the one closer to me right there. They're both 15 millimeter, so it takes quite a bit more force to get those off too. Sorry about the neighbor's lawnmower in the background, but again, I just had to use the PB blaster, spray it down in the holes, and then just take a hammer to it, and I was able to basically get it broke loose. So get that off and get the hub cleaned up. So rotor's off. This happens to be a rotor drum mix, so the drum is on the back side. This is for your parking brake. My parking brake works fine, so I don't need to adjust this, but if you had to adjust it, there's a little rubber grommet plug on the back side. You can pop that out and then use a screwdriver to adjust the drums out on each side. We'll see what happens when I slide on the new rotor, but for right now, I don't think that's going to need to be adjusted. And now we're going to go ahead and put on some of the anti-seize. Okay, so we got the anti-seize on the back of the rotor. Got the inside of the drum area that connects to the parking brake cleaned up with the brake parts cleaner. Both sides of the rotor. Was able to slide that on. It went over, no issues, not having to adjust it. Now we're going to go ahead and clean up our bracket. These are pretty gummed up, so I pull these out, and I'm going to go ahead and get them all wiped down and put on some new silicone grease and get these really lubed up inside, and then reinstall them, and I'll do that on both. This one's pretty seized up too. Then replace the two clips. Okay, I went ahead and got the pins lubed up nice and well on the inside, and then installed the two gliding brackets. So we'll go ahead and get this mounted back up. Throw a little silicone on the sliders, a little silicone on the back of the brake pads, and get the caliper itself cleaned up. Went ahead and torqued down the upper and lower bolt for the bracket, and now we'll go ahead and we're ready to get this caliper on, get it cleaned up, throw a little silicone on the moving part areas, and then we'll put in our brake pads. Because I wasn't able to get the piston seated earlier, I just went old school and got the C-clamp out. You can see pressure, torque it down, and then you can go ahead and it should seat flush in there for you. So just a little trick, if you don't have any special brake tools, you can just use a C-clamp. So I have both pads, not quite both of them, but one in, and you can see here on the glide it just hooks around it. So it actually requires you to push down and up on that to make that pad slide in, just to get in contact with the rotor. So don't worry about that. You're just gonna have to use some pressure to get it to slide in, and it'll be the same for the other side. And then we'll get the caliper on. Okay, so caliper is on. Now what we're gonna do is get ready to put the wheel on, but let's throw some anti-seize on the back of the wheel. And then, just to clarify, the slot needs to be facing towards the back of the vehicle, and that will identify as being your left side, driver's side. There's also markings on the top of the rotor. This one's actually painted, so the markings are hard to see, but they are left and right specific directional. Went ahead and added the anti-seize to the back of the wheel. We'll go ahead and get it mounted up, torque down, and get the cap on. Let's go ahead and go over the part numbers for the rear left side. So the rotor itself is 633-93001L. Your ceramic pads are 1310-1120-00. And the hardware kit is 340-93001. This is all for the left side rear, except for the pads and the kit that will actually be for both sides. If you're going to obviously do the right side, then you're just changing the L to an R, and that will be the same for the part numbers I gave earlier for the front side. That's going to wrap it up for today. Thanks for hanging out with me. Feel free to like, subscribe, share, comment below. One last thing that you want to do is make sure that you pump your brakes, get the brake pads pushed out onto the rotor, and then your final process is you're going to have to bed in the pads into the rotors. That's a whole nother process in itself. You'll have to research how to do that. I'm not going to go over that. But I'll see you next time. Thanks.